Join me as I try to figure out what went wrong when a Boeing 727 crashes after landing too long at Madeira Airport. It was raining so hard that night that even the most experienced pilots would have hesitated before making an approach. But for TAP Flight 425, turning back wasn't an option. Dozens of passengers, tired from delays and rough weather, sat anxiously in the narrow cabin of the Boeing 727 as lightning illuminated the Atlantic skies around Madeira Island. The pilots strained their eyes through sheets of rain, hoping to spot the runway lights at Funchal Airport, a place infamous among pilots for its short runway, unpredictable winds, and dangerous terrain. What they didn't know was that within minutes they would overshoot the runway, crash into the sea, and spark one of the darkest nights in Portuguese aviation history. The night was November 19, 1977. TAP Air Portugal Flight 425 was a Boeing 727-2, 182 ADV, registered as CSTBR, operating from Brussels, Belgium, with a stop in Lisbon before continuing to Funchal, the capital of Madeira Island. On board were 156 passengers and 8 crew members. Madeira's runway back then was only 600 meters long, barely enough for a 727 to land safely, especially under heavy rain and strong crosswinds. Yet the island's rugged beauty made it a popular destination, and airlines continued flying there despite the risks. The crew of Flight 425 had already been briefed about the challenging weather. Thunderstorms hovered near the airport, and visibility fluctuated rapidly. The approach would have to be visual. The pilots needed to see the runway before landing, but with the downpour, that seemed almost impossible. Still, after holding in the air for over an hour, they were cleared to attempt an approach. Fuel was running low, and the passengers were growing restless. As the Boeing 727 descended toward the island, the pilots could see nothing but darkness and flashes of lightning reflecting off the clouds. The captain, an experienced aviator named Jose Martins, made calm but firm commands to his crew. He had landed in Madeira before, but this time was different. The wind was gusting violently, pushing the aircraft sideways. The rain blurred every reference point. Still, he pressed on. The approach was difficult from the start. The airplane came in too high, and the crew had to perform a go-around, a maneuver to climb back and try again. But each attempt meant burning more fuel, and time was slipping away. Ground control informed them of worsening conditions. Other aircraft were diverting to nearby airports, but the captain decided to try one last time. He believed they could make it. On the third attempt, the aircraft lined up with the runway. The passengers could now see faint lights through the storm. Some began clapping softly, thinking they were finally safe. The Boeing 727 touched down, but it was far down the runway, almost halfway through. The rain had turned the asphalt into a slick surface, and hydroplaning immediately set in. The aircraft wasn't slowing down fast enough. The pilots slammed on the brakes, reverse thrust, and deployed the spoilers, but the momentum was too great. The runway ended abruptly at a cliff overlooking the sea. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared. The captain shouted for full reverse thrust, but the wet surface offered no grip. The nose of the aircraft dipped, and within seconds, the Boeing 727 skidded off the end of the runway, crashed through a small embankment, and plunged down a 200-foot slope. The front of the plane exploded into flames as it hit the beach below, breaking apart on impact. The sound was heard across the airport and nearby villages, a deafening roar followed by the echo of explosions. Residents rushed out into the rain, terrified, while airport workers ran toward the flames lighting up the coastline. The once beautiful night sky of Madeira had turned into an inferno. For those still conscious inside the aircraft, the horror was unimaginable. Fire spread rapidly through the cabin as debris and luggage fell from overhead compartments. The survivors described screams, smoke, and chaos. Some passengers near the tail section managed to unbuckle and escape through openings in the wreckage. But for most of those seated in the front and middle sections, there was no chance. Rescue teams struggled to reach the crash site. The terrain was steep, muddy, and dangerously close to the sea. Rain continued to pour, washing debris into the water. By the time firefighters arrived, the flames had engulfed most of the fuselage. The rescue operation was chaotic, with volunteers using ropes and makeshift ladders to reach the survivors. Local fishermen joined in, pulling people from the wreckage with bare hands. In the end, out of 164 people on board, only 33 survived. The rest 131 souls lost their lives that night. It was the deadliest accident in the history of Air Portugal, and one of the worst aviation disasters in Portugal's history. When investigators arrived, they faced a grim scene. The Boeing 727 was scattered in pieces along the hillside and beach. The cockpit was completely destroyed, and much of the fuselage had burned to ashes. Black boxes were recovered after an intense search. An analysis began immediately. The initial findings were clear. The aircraft had landed long. Instead of touching down near the start of the runway, it had touched down about 2.0 feet beyond it, leaving far too little room to stop. The combination of rain, hydroplaning, and tailwind made the situation hopeless once the plane was on the ground. But that wasn't the only issue. Investigators looked deeper into why the pilots continued their approach in such poor conditions. They discovered that the decision-making process was heavily influenced by pressure to complete the flight. At the time, there were limited diversion options, and returning to Lisbon would have meant hours of delay, refueling, and upset passengers. In addition, the captain had made 2 previous go-arounds and likely believed the third attempt had to succeed. Flight data showed the aircraft was still fast during touchdown. The captain might have realized it too late, but decided against another go-around because of the low fuel state. Once the wheels hit the slick runway, braking efficiency dropped drastically. Hydroplaning meant the tires rode over a thin layer of water instead of gripping the surface. Reverse thrust, though applied immediately, wasn't enough to compensate. The investigation also noted the condition of Madeira's runway. In 1977, it was one of the shortest for a jet airliner of that size. Pilots worldwide had already raised concerns, and several airlines avoided flying large aircraft there. There were no modern grooved surfaces to help with water drainage, no engineered materials arresting systems, and no extended safety zones. If a plane overshot, there was only a cliff and the ocean beyond. Public outrage followed the tragedy. Families of victims demanded answers and criticized airport safety standards. Air Portugal faced enormous pressure to explain why their crew attempted landing despite the conditions. The airline defended the professionalism of its pilots, but the accident forced the aviation authorities to reevaluate everything about Funchal Airport. As weeks turned into months, wreckage was gradually removed, and memories of that night haunted survivors and rescuers alike. Many described being tormented by the sound of rain or the sight of the ocean. One survivor, sitting near the tail, recalled how a flash of lightning illuminated the cabin just before the crash. He saw panic on everyone's faces, then blackness. In response to the disaster, Madeira's airport underwent major reconstruction. Authorities extended the runway using large concrete pillars built into the ocean, eventually doubling its length to over 700 meters. That extension transformed one of the world's most dangerous runways into a modern, safer facility. To this day, the extension stands as both an engineering marvel and a memorial to those lost on Flight 425. But the lessons learned went far beyond runway design. The crash of Flight 425 changed how airlines and pilots approached wet, weather landings and decision-making under pressure. Pilots were encouraged to divert earlier when conditions were unsafe, regardless of passenger frustration or scheduling delays. Runway overrun prevention systems were developed later, helping future aircraft avoid similar fates. Even now, decades later, pilots who fly to Madeira are reminded of that night. They're trained specifically on how to handle its approach, winds, and sudden weather changes. For them, TP Flight 425 isn't just history, it's a warning written in fire and rain. The story of that crash continues to echo through aviation circles. Every year, on the anniversary of the accident, some locals and families of victims gather near the coastline where the Boeing 727 came to rest. Flowers are thrown into the sea, prayers are whispered, and the names of those lost are read aloud. The waves crash against the rocks just as they did that night, carrying away pieces of memory into the Atlantic. The Boeing 727 was once one of the most reliable aircraft in the world, a workhorse for airlines, but no machine can overcome the forces of nature combined with human judgment under pressure. Flight 425's crew fought until the very last second, trying everything they could to save their passengers. Yet in aviation, even a few hundred meters can mean the difference between a safe landing and catastrophe. In interviews years later, retired TP pilots described how that accident changed their mindset. One of them said, "After Madeira, we all learned that no destination is worth risking a landing that doesn't feel right. You can always try again somewhere else, but you can't try again if you go too far." The Boeing 727 that night carried tourists, business travelers, and families. Some were returning home, others visiting Madeira for the first time. Among the victims were children, couples celebrating anniversaries, and entire families wiped out in seconds. Their stories were told across newspapers and television, sparking national mourning. Portuguese investigators finalized their report the following year. They concluded that pilot error and poor weather conditions were the direct causes of the accident, but they also placed responsibility on the airport's inadequate safety features. The final recommendation: extend the runway, improve drainage, and install better lighting and navigation aids. TAP implemented new training programs for its crews, emphasizing the importance of go-arounds and decision authority. The airline also revised its weather minimums for Madeira, ensuring that aircraft would not attempt landings under such extreme conditions again. As the years passed, air travel became safer, and lessons from accidents like Flight 425 were embedded into aviation regulations worldwide. The International Civil Aviation Organization adopted new standards for runway safety zones, and modern airports incorporated engineered materials designed to stop aircraft that overshoot. But behind every regulation is a tragedy that made it necessary. Behind every pilot checklist lies a memory of those who paid the price for progress. TP Flight 425 is one of those stories, a reminder that safety in aviation is built on the lessons written in pain and loss. If you stand today on the cliffs near Funchal and look out toward the ocean, you'll see planes landing smoothly on the long extended runway. The approach is still dramatic. Pilots still navigate through crosswinds and turbulence, but the risk is no longer what it once was. Few tourists realize that beneath that concrete extension lies the site where 131 lives were lost, and where the island of Madeira learned one of its hardest lessons. Sometimes progress rises from tragedy. The flames that once consumed Flight 425 lit a path towards safer skies for generations that followed. The people of Madeira never forgot that night, and neither did the aviation world. As lightning flickered above the Atlantic that November evening, TP Flight 425's crew believed they were almost home. Instead, they became part of a story that would forever change aviation history. Their final moments were not marked by failure, but by the relentless human drive to fight against impossible odds. And while the ocean claimed their aircraft, their legacy endures in every safe landing that follows, a silent promise made to those who never made it home.